The wind howled through the canyon like a warning, cold and sharp, as if the mountains themselves were whispering judgment. 17-year-old Clara Whitmore sat silently in the back of her father's old buckboard wagon, her hands trembling and her eyes wide with disbelief. Her dress, once white and lacy, now hung heavy with dust and shame. The late autumn sun dipped behind the ridges as the wagon rattled up the narrow mountain trail, her heart pounding louder than the horse's hooves. She wanted to scream too, cry, to jump and run, but she had nowhere to go. She was being delivered like a burden, like cattle to the last man her father could find who'd take her as punishment for getting pregnant, for embarrassing a powerful name. For breaking the rules, her father, Judge Arthur Whitmore, was a man who ran an entire town with his word. But he couldn't control his daughter, nor the town's whispers. Clara had always been curious, gentle, and hopeful, but her mother had died when she was just a child, and Clara had grown up under a roof where kindness was weakness. Her only escape had been in books, and the occasional secret walk near the train station where the world passed by. It was there she had met Samuel, a young laborer with ink-stained fingers and a dream of leaving town for a better life. One kiss. One soft word. That was all it took to shatter her world. When her father found out she was carrying Samuel's child, he didn't even ask who the father was. He didn't listen. Didn't care that Samuel had disappeared without a trace, likely. Run out of town by Judge Whitmore's men, her father had simply declared she was to be disposed of. In his eyes, she'd ruined her value as a daughter. She would never be allowed to marry now. But there was one man deep in the mountains who would take her and raise the child if she worked for him. A man who owed her father a debt. A man with a reputation, wild, rugged, silent. That man's name was Elias Stone. Elias had once been part of society. Years ago, he had worn clean shirts and worked as a blacksmith. In town, but after a fire took his wife and child, he'd vanished into the wilderness. They said he lived off the land, spoke to no one, and hadn't stepped foot into civilization for 5 years. Some called him dangerous, others called him broken. Clara had never heard his name until this day. The wagon stopped outside a weathered cabin surrounded by thick pine trees and the growling hush of distant wolves. Clara's father didn't even help her down. He simply tossed her bag onto the dirt, said, "You're his problem now," and drove away without looking back. She stood there frozen, holding her belly protectively, eyes wide as the door creaked open. And then she saw him. Elias Stone was. Taller than any man she'd ever seen, his broad shoulders filled the doorway like a wall. A heavy beard shadowed his face, and his eyes icy blue looked at her not with judgment, but silence. He wore a fur-lined coat and boots worn from years of use. One arm held a heavy axe, the other just hung at his side. She wasn't sure whether to speak or run. Then he spoke, low and gravelly. "You hungry?" Clara nodded hesitantly. He turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open. That was it. Made no anger. No cruelty. Just ... acceptance. Inside, the cabin was warm, dim, and smelled of wood smoke. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The furniture was rough, handmade but clean. A large bare pelt covered the floor. She noticed a second chair had been dusted off. A place had been set at the table for two, it prepared. She sat slowly, unsure. Elias ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls and set one in front of her. "Eat," he said, and she did. Ravenously, that first night. She slept on a cot in the corner while Elias sat in his rocker, staring into the fire. He never once looked at her with disdain or asked what she had done.
Oh.
And for the first time in months, she didn't cry herself to sleep. The next morning, Elias handed her a warm coat and boots. "You'll need to learn," he said. "This land won't forgive weakness. I won't coddle you, but I'll feed you. I'll protect the child. You pull your weight, you'll have a place here." Clara didn't know what to say. She just nodded. Over. The weeks that followed, she learned more than she ever thought possible. Elias taught her to split firewood, to cook over open flame, to trap rabbits, to stitch torn clothes. He never raised his voice, never touched her, but his presence was solid like the mountain itself. The first snow came early. Clara rapped, her arms around her growing belly, watching Elias chop wood shirtless, steam rising from his skin. She didn't understand how a man so hardened by tragedy could be so gentle without speaking it. One night, a storm knocked out part of the roof. Clara climbed onto a ladder in the cold to help him patch it. She slipped, cried out. Tandy caught her, strong hands gripping her waist. Their eyes met in the snow. "I got you," he said. The words stayed with her all night. Soon she began to open up. She told him her name. Told him about the man who had left her. About her father. About the shame. Elias didn't offer pity, just quiet. That somehow was more healing than anything. "You are not what they called you," he said once. "A mistake doesn't define you." Every day she grew stronger, more confident. She began to smile again, laugh even. And every time she caught Elias watching her, something strange happened in her chest. Something warm one morning. She went into labor. It was early. Snow blanketed the cabin. Clara screamed, sweat pouring down her face. Elias, despite his size, moved with unexpected gentleness. He wiped her brow, held her hand, whispered, "You're not alone, not anymore." After hours of agony, the cries of a newborn filled the cabin. A girl, tiny and perfect. Elias held her with both arms, and Clara saw something break in him, something deep and hidden. Tears fell down his cheeks for the first time. "She's beautiful," he whispered. So was Clara. The days that followed were unlike anything Clara imagined. Elias made a cradle from pine and fed them both. He wasn't just caring. He was present, steady. Real. One night, holding her daughter by the fire, Clara turned to him. "Why did you take me in?" she asked. Elias stared into the flames.
"Because?"
No one should be punished for needing love. Tears rolled down her cheeks. The shame, the pain, the fear, it all melted away.
"Ash."
Because here, in the heart of the wild, she had found what no one in town had ever given her. Dignity, peace, a second chance, and maybe even love. Snow fell thick and heavy in the days after Clara gave birth. The world outside their mountain cabin turned white and quiet, like the past had been buried beneath a clean blanket of silence. Inside, the fire was always lit, and Elias had built a rhythm for them, a routine that felt like a heartbeat. He chopped wood every morning before sunrise. Clara nursed the baby, who she named Grace. They ate, worked, sometimes sat in the evenings watching the flames without a word. But in that silence, something powerful lived. Clara no longer felt afraid when the wind howled. She no longer flinched at every creak in the floor. Instead, she found herself humming lullabies to Grace, smiling when Elias handed her a carved wooden toy he'd made for the baby, and laughing, really laughing for the first time in months. When a snowball fight broke out between them one morning during chores, she hadn't expected life with a man like Elias to be filled with peace, but that's what he gave her: quiet strength, dignity. But peace is never permanent. It was mid-January when the first crack in their fragile world came. Elias had gone out to hunt. He was gone for longer than usual. Clara bundled Grace and stepped outside, her boots crunching on the snow, her eyes searching the tree line. When she spotted him, she froze. He wasn't alone. 3 men followed him, armed, well-fed, with the look of lawmen, or worse. Clara's stomach dropped, her heart raced. She ducked back into the cabin, placed Grace in the cradle, and grabbed the hunting knife Elias kept by the hearth. When the door opened, Elias stepped in first, his jaw tight. "It's all right," he said, though his voice lacked its usual calm. "They followed me from town. One of them says he's a deputy." Clara stood, clutching the knife. "What do they want?" The lead man stepped forward. He had a smug face, a gold tooth, and the kind of sneer that made her skin crawl. "Miss Whitmore," he said, mockingly polite. "Your father's been asking about you. Said you ran off into the hills. Made a mistake," he said, "letting you go. Sent us to bring you back." Her blood turned to ice. She glanced at Elias, whose fists clenched. "I didn't run," she said quietly. "He gave me away, like cattle. The deputy chuckled. "Well, he's changed his mind," says the child brings shame. "That it needs to disappear," says the man who took you ain't fit to raise a squirrel, let alone a woman and a bastard baby. Clara lunged forward. "Don't you dare," Elias raised a hand gently. Not to silence her, but to reassure her. Then he stepped between her and the men. His voice dropped like thunder. "You tell Judge Whitmore," he growled, "that this woman and her child are under my protection. You try to take her, and it'll be the last thing you do." The deputy laughed, but it didn't last. Elias's eyes were like stone. Not angry, not wild, just resolute. The men exchanged glances, clearly unsure if this quiet giant might snap. Their necks without blinking. Finally, the deputy spat on the floor, turned, and muttered, "We'll be back with more men." The moment they were gone, Elias bolted the door. Clara stood frozen, her knuckles white on the knife. Elias walked over and gently took it from her fingers. "You did good," he said. "You stood your ground." "I thought this was over," she whispered. "I thought he was done with me." "Men like that don't let go of control," Elias said. "He doesn't want you back. He just wants to erase his shame." Clara swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Grace, now cooing in her cradle. "We don't run," he said finally. "Not anymore." That night, neither of them slept. The next week, Elias taught Clara how to shoot, set up cans along a log, and handed her the rifle. She missed the first 10 times, but he never scolded. Just kept saying again. By the third day, she was hitting every target. As the snow deepened, so did their bond. One morning, Clara caught Elias staring at her as she fed Grace. There was something in his eyes, something tender, cautious, protective. "Why do you care so much?" she asked him softly. "You could have let me freeze? Could have turned me away?" Elias stared at the fire. "I lost a wife once, and a daughter. I failed them, out on our house, trying to keep them warm. Been living with that every day since." Clara reached out and touched his hand. He didn't flinch. "You didn't fail me," she whispered. "You saved me." Their fingers remained intertwined. That evening, as Grace slept, Clara stepped close to Elias by the fire. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. Elias looked at her, startled. "You should be. Your father's powerful. Those men? I'm not afraid of them," she said. "I'm not afraid of love either. Not anymore." And then without asking, she kissed him, slow, soft, honest. Elias didn't move at first. Then he wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel. It was the beginning of something real, but the next day it came crashing down. The attack came before dawn. The sound of hooves, the shouting of men, the crack of gunfire. Elias was already awake. He grabbed the rifle, kicked open the door, and returned fire as Clara rushed to hide Grace beneath the floorboards, a secret hatch he had built for food. Storage, but now held their most precious treasure. Elias fought like a man possessed. He took a bullet to the shoulder, but didn't flinch. Clara fired from the window, dropping one of the attackers. For nearly 30 minutes, the cabin was a battlefield, and then it went still. Smoke curled in the sky. Elias collapsed against the wall, bleeding but alive. Clara ran to him, pressing her hands to his wound. "Don't you dare die on me," she said, eyes fierce with tears. He looked up at her. "You've got fire," he whispered. "So do you," she choked. In the end, the men who came to drag her back never returned. A neighbor from another valley, hearing the gunfire, rode into town and told the sheriff what he'd seen. The sheriff, who had once known Elias, came up the mountain a week later not to arrest him, but to shake his hand. Judge Whitmore's influence ended there. The town turned against him when word spread that he'd tried to kill his own grandchild, and Elias. Stone? He wasn't feared anymore. He was respected. Months passed. Spring arrived in the valley, melting the snow, bringing life to the earth again. Clara planted flowers by the cabin and watched Grace learn to crawl. Elias built a second room, one for the child. And one morning, as they stood on the ridge watching the sunrise, he handed Clara a small wooden box. Inside was a carved ring. I've lost a lot, he said quietly. But you gave me something back I thought was gone. Hope, family, and if you'll have me? Clara kissed him before he could finish. I already do, she whispered. The cabin was never lonely again. Clara never returned to town. She didn't need their approval. She had found something stronger than reputation, something more powerful than shame. She had found love in a man the world had forgotten. In a child she'd once been told to give up, and in herself her past didn't define her anymore. Her future did, and it began with a mountain, a man, and the child who changed everything.